world moves in a state of perpetual, exhausted motion, caught in an unending cycle of defense. If a man were to walk through the crowded corridors of modern existence, he would not see people living. He would see them dodging. They flinch at the sound of the morning notification chime, brace their shoulders against the unseen pressure of economic volatility, and walk through their professional and personal lives as though caught in an open field under a sky dark with invisible archery. Every day is a skirmish. Every relationship carries the latent threat of a sudden wound. Every bank balance, every health report, and every passing remark is weighed on the sensitive scales of potential catastrophe. Consider the paradox of this endless struggle. Humanity has mastered the earth, split the atom, and peered into the farthest reaches of the cosmos, yet it remains fundamentally terrified of tomorrow. The individual moves from crisis to crisis, nursing old bruises, building higher walls, and wondering why life feels like an eternal, agonizing push against an incline that grows steeper with every passing year. They feel like targets helpless, exposed, and designated for misfortune by an indifferent or hostile universe. Yet, within the deep, unbroken silence that precedes the dawn of realization, a quiet, staggering truth waits to be uncovered. If a man were given a secret word, a single, precise utterance capable of arresting an arrow in mid-air, suspending its momentum, and causing it to drop harmlessly to the dust, what name would he give to such a phenomenon? Would he call it magic, a fleeting illusion born of theatrical trickery? Or would he recognize it for what it truly is? An exact, unyielding law of the spiritual cosmos. Florence Scovel Shinn understood this law with the clarity of a master alchemist. She taught that every human being possesses such a word, encoded into their divine design. It is more powerful than any weapon formed against them, sharper than any circumstance, and infinitely more reliable than human willpower. Yet, the vast majority of mankind walks past this treasure, searching everywhere else for salvation, locked in a trance of perpetual defense because they have forgotten the sound of their own authority. To understand why mankind remains trapped in this state of chronic defense, one must deconstruct the mechanical nature of human reaction through the lens of psychological and philosophical depth. Why do human beings instinctively adopt a defensive posture when faced with adversity? Because the unawakened ego operates entirely on the plane of duality. It perceives the world as a theater of separate forces, some friendly, but most inherently threatening. When a negative circumstance arises, whether it is a malicious rumor, a financial deficit, or a sudden betrayal, the ego immediately identifies with the threat, establishing a polarity of combat, me against the world. How does this combat manifest in the subtle architecture of consciousness? Through resistance. When a person hates a debt, resents a rival, or fears a diagnosis, they pour their most vital emotional energy directly into the very thing they wish to repel. By fighting the shadow, they feed it. They establish a psychic tether that binds them inexorably to the object of their aversion. To break this bond, Florence Scovel Shinn introduced a concept that routinely shocks the uninitiated: blessing your enemy. Most people recoil at this instruction. They hear the word blessing and filter it through centuries of cultural conditioning that equates the term with weakness, passivity, or religious submission. They believe blessing means becoming a doormat, smiling, while someone destroys your livelihood, or turning the other cheek so that the offender may strike again. This is a profound misunderstanding of spiritual physics. In the high kingdom of the spirit, blessing is never passive. It is the most aggressive, sovereign, and strategic act an individual can perform. It is a literal robbery. When an adversary sends an arrow of malice, or when a circumstance hurls an arrow of lack toward your peace, they are operating under a psychic law of cause and effect. They require your reactive hostility to complete their circuit. Your anger, your fear, and your bitterness act as the target, the landing pad, and the fuel that gives their attack its kinetic force. When you choose to bless the very situation that is attempting to ruin you, or the very debt that is threatening to crush your spirit, you perform an act of supreme psychological hijacking. You refuse to play your assigned role in their drama. You strip the situation of its legal right to harm you under spiritual law. By shifting your consciousness from reaction to sovereign command, you reach out into the invisible ether, take the power directly out of the hands of circumstance, and place it firmly back where it belongs, within your own divine dominion. You cease to be the target, you become the master of the field. Imagine a man named Julian, who spent 40 years of his life standing in front of a massive, imposing iron door. It was set deep within a wall of cold, gray stone, towering high above him, locked with heavy, rusted bolts that gleamed ominously in the dim light of his reality. Behind this door lay everything he had ever prayed for: abundant supply, profound creative fulfillment, radiant health, and deep, enduring peace. For decades, Julian had treated that door as his ultimate adversary. Every morning, he woke up with a knot of anxiety in his stomach, marched up to the barrier, and threw his entire physical and emotional weight against it. He bruised his shoulders, he bloodied his knuckles, he wept hot, bitter tears at its iron threshold. He cursed the wood, he cursed the metal, and he screamed angry questions into the void, demanding to know why the universe had barred him from his rightful inheritance. The harder he pushed, the more unyielding the door felt. The more he raged against it, the deeper the iron bolts seemed to sink into their sockets. He believed utterly that external forces, bad luck, systemic unfairness, and bad timing were conspiring to keep him locked outside of his good. One evening, exhausted to the very marrow of his bones, Julian collapsed against the base of the iron door. He had no strength left to fight. His anger had burned out, leaving only the quiet ash of utter defeat. As he sat there in the silence, leaning his head against the cold metal, he noticed something peculiar. The door was not vibrating with the resistance of an opposing force. It was entirely still. In that quiet stillness, a sudden, piercing insight flashed through his awareness, echoing the timeless wisdom of Florence Scovel Shinn. The door is not locked from the outside. Julian realized with staggering clarity that there was no keeper of the gate. There was no cruel warden holding him back. The very act of his frantic pushing, his desperate resistance, his obsessive fear, and his perpetual struggle was the exact force that kept the heavy bolt securely in place. His push was the lock. His fight was the chain. Slowly, trembling with a strange new realization, Julian stopped pushing. He drew a deep breath, let his bruised shoulders drop, and instead of cursing the barrier, he reached out his hand, laid his palm gently against the cold iron, and whispered a quiet, unexpected blessing over the door itself. He thanked the obstacle for teaching him his own strength. He baptized the heavy metal as a gateway of absolute success. In that exact instant, before his eyes could even register the change, a soft, mechanical click echoed through the stone corridor. The heavy iron bolts disengaged, sliding effortlessly back into the frame. The massive door swung open on silent hinges, revealing an endless, sunlit horizon stretching out before him. The struggle had never been about breaking down a wall. It had only ever been about releasing the grip of resistance. The journey of transformation does not begin with an external revolution. It begins with an internal surrender of the weapon of defense. To embody this truth today, the seeker must make a quiet, unyielding vow to stop fighting the shadows of their current reality. When an unexpected bill arrives, when a harsh word is spoken, or when a door appears closed, the initial instinct to tense, panic, and strike back must be met with the supreme discipline of stillness. You are invited to practice this precise shift in the hours that follow. Do not brace against your life. Do not throw your weight against the iron doors of your current limitations. Recognize that every burden you carry is sustained only by the energy of your resistance. When you feel the familiar tightening of fear in your chest, pause, breathe deeply, and whisper the secret word of blessing into the center of the storm. Take a quiet moment right now to reflect on the heaviest burden you are currently carrying in your professional or personal life. Acknowledge its presence without fear, and silently release your resistance to it. The mechanics of spiritual defense are clear, but the shadows of life are cunning, wearing many disguises to trick the unwatchful soul back into the prison of reaction. Why do these shadows possess such persuasive power over the human mind? How do they maintain their hold when the individual believes they are fighting for their survival? The answers lie hidden just beyond the threshold, in the silent, deceptive anatomy of the shadow itself. The chamber is utterly devoid of warmth, lit only by the flickering, amber-dying embers of a hearth that has long since ceased to provide comfort. In the center of this barren room stands a man possessed by a frantic, consuming madness. He faces a blank, whitewashed stone wall where a towering, grotesque shadow has been cast by an unseen light behind him. The shadow is broad-shouldered, menacing, and jagged, mimicking every twitch of his nervous system with terrifying precision. Seized by a primal terror, the man balls his hands into tight fists and begins to scream at the wall. He hurls insults at the silhouette, demanding that it shrink, that it step aside, that it vanish from his sight. When words fail to move it, he launches himself forward, throwing his entire body weight against the flat plaster, punching and kicking the empty air where the phantom shape looms. His knuckles bleed against the stone, his breath comes in ragged, searing gasps. Sweat pours down his temples, stinging his eyes. Yet, the shadow remains entirely unaffected. It does not bruise, it does not flinch, and it does not yield an inch of ground. The man collapses onto the cold, deeply utter exhaustion, his muscles burning with fatigue while the shadow still towers mercilessly above him, cold, detached, and immutable. This is the exact posture of the unawakened soul wandering through the labyrinth of human existence. Humanity spends its days waging war against phantoms. The legal battle that hangs over a family like a guillotine, the toxic superior in the corporate hierarchy whose very presence induces a visceral tightening of the chest, the chronic illness that whispers quiet prophecies of doom in the stillness of midnight, these are not solid, independent entities endowed with a life of their own. They are spiritual shadows. For generations, mankind has been conditioned to treat these shadows as tangible enemies. Men and women scream at their deaths, argue with their diagnoses, and plot bitter vengeance against those who have wronged them, believing that if they shout loud enough or strike hard enough, the darkness will eventually retreat. But a shadow cannot be defeated by fists. It cannot be negotiated with, soothed, or overthrown by force. As long as the individual stands before the wall and treats the projection as a real adversary, they are locked in a tragic, unwinnable war against their own reflection, burning away their vital life force on an illusion that feeds entirely upon their resistance. To dismantle the illusion of the shadow, one must subject the mechanics of human suffering to a rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction, utilizing the depth of recursive thinking to probe beneath the surface of everyday experience. Why does the human mind instantly perceive a life crisis as a tangible, aggressive enemy? Because the survival architecture of the brain is hardwired for threat detection. It categorizes the unfamiliar, the painful, and the inconvenient as external predators that must be fought or fled. How does this primitive survival mechanism perpetuate the very suffering it seeks to avoid? Through the alchemy of attention and emotional investment, the mind operates as a supreme magnifier. Whatever it gazes upon with fear, anger, or obsession is instantly endowed with substance and persistence in the subjective universe of the individual. When a person hates a burden, why does that hatred paradoxically anchor the burden more deeply into their reality? Because hatred is an energetic binding agent. To hate something is to maintain a continuous, unbroken psychological connection to it. The soul constantly pours its most refined fuel focus, emotion, and imagination into the very container of the problem. How does this energetic feeding process sustain a spiritual shadow? Consider that a shadow possesses no intrinsic light source, no internal organs, no autonomous will. It is merely an absence, a dark silhouette projected onto a surface because an object has blocked the light. Yet, when an individual flies into a rage against a bad circumstance, they are treating that absence as a monumental presence. They are feeding the projection with their own emotional heat, giving the shadow the very energy it needs to appear solid, permanent, and threatening. Philosophically speaking, burdens are often kept alive, reinforced, and anchored in place precisely by the fierce resistance of the ego that wishes to be rid of them. The legal suit does not persist because of the lawyers alone. It persists because the litigant breathes life into it every hour of the day through obsessive worry. The toxic relationship does not endure merely through the cruelty of the other person, it is sustained by the endless mental replays of betrayal running through the victim's mind. To break this vicious cycle, seeker must execute the single move that the ego fears above all else. They must cease their resistance. They must stop fighting the shadow and dare to baptize the situation with a completely new name. They must look at the exact circumstance that feels like an executioner, strip away its mask of malice, and name it success. This is not mere positive thinking or toxic optimism. It is the fundamental spiritual law of dissolving an illusion by withdrawing the energy that sustains it. When the fight stops, the friction ceases. When the friction ceases, the shadow loses its fuel. And when the fuel is gone, the phantom quietly dissolves back into the light from whence it came. In the annals of mid-20th century legal history, there lived a man named Nathaniel Vance, a brilliant architect whose life was suddenly upended by a devastating, malicious lawsuit filed by a former business partner. The partner, driven by spite and greed, sought to strip Nathaniel of his patents, his life savings, and his professional reputation. For the first 18 months, Nathaniel lived in a state of chronic, white-hot warfare. He hired high-priced attorneys, spent his nights poring over legal briefs with bloodshot eyes, and rehearsed bitter, devastating counter-arguments in his mind while walking the empty city streets at 3 a.m. Every conversation he had revolved around the lawsuit. Every meal tasted of ashes because his mind was consumed by the injustice of the attack. Yet, despite his relentless fighting, the situation only worsened. The court dates kept multiplying, the legal fees mounted like a towering pyre, and Nathaniel's health began to fail under the crushing weight of relentless stress. He was aging before his time, his creative genius choked out by the constant, suffocating cloud of litigation. One evening, after receiving a particularly grim motion from opposing counsel, Nathaniel sat at his drafting table, staring at the blueprints of a cathedral he could no longer focus on building. A profound exhaustion washed over him, not just physical tiredness, but a deep, soul-level weariness of spirit. He realized with startling clarity that he had spent 2 years feeding a monster with his own life force. Every angry thought he directed at his former partner was an arrow he was firing into the air, only to have it fall back down upon his own head. He had made the lawsuit his master, his companion, and his obsession. With trembling hands, Nathaniel pushed the legal documents away from him, switched off the desk lamp, and sat in the quiet shadows of his studio. He made a radical, terrifying decision. He stopped fighting. He stopped reviewing the files. He stopped rehearsing his anger. He stopped cursing the name of his enemy. Instead, he did something that felt entirely unnatural to his wounded ego. He closed his eyes, brought the image of the lawsuit into his mind, and whispered into the quiet room, "I release you. I no longer feed you with my anger. I baptize this entire situation as a channel for divine justice and ultimate success." The next morning, Nathaniel woke up with a strange, light sensation in his chest, as if a heavy iron anchor had been unclipped from his soul. He went to his drafting table and returned to his architectural designs, refusing to let the legal battle occupy a single second of his mental real estate. Within 3 weeks of Nathaniel withdrawing his emotional fuel from the conflict, a startling series of events unfolded entirely outside his control. His former partner's primary financial backer suddenly pulled out of the venture due to unrelated scandals, leaving the opposing legal team starved of resources. Simultaneously, a neutral intermediary stepped forward with an unexpected, highly favorable settlement proposal that handed Nathaniel complete ownership of his patents and covered all legal costs. The monstrous shadow that had haunted him for years did not vanish because Nathaniel outfought it in the courtroom. It vanished because Nathaniel turned off the light of his resistance, allowing the phantom to collapse into nothingness. The lesson of the shadow is clear. Yet the human heart clings stubbornly to its grievances, seduced by the false comfort of righteous indignation. To embody this truth today, the seeker must cultivate an uncompromising vigilance over their own internal landscape. When a hardship presents itself, whether it is an unpaid invoice, a broken relationship, or a professional snub, the immediate impulse to wage war must be intercepted at the threshold of consciousness. You are invited to examine your current burdens through a new lens. Identify the one problem in your life that you have been fighting the hardest, punching against the wall day after day with clenched fists and exhausted tears. Recognize that your fierce emotional resistance is the very thing holding that shadow in place upon the wall of your reality. Recognizing the shadow and ceasing to fight it is only the first movement of the master alchemist. But how does one actively engage with the adversary when it stands directly in your path? What is the precise psychological and spiritual mechanism required to face a crisis without blinking? The answer lies waiting in the opening movement of Florence Scovel Shinn's sacred protocol, the unblinking, direct look. The morning light filters through the sheer curtains of a quiet bedroom, catching floating motes of dust in a silent dance, but inside the consciousness of the sleeper waking up to reality, there is no peace, there is only the sudden, cold grip of dread. It is the precise moment of awakening, that fragile microsecond between sleep and full consciousness, where the mind remembers its burdens. A wave of visceral heat rises from the stomach, tightening the chest into an iron band. The heart hammers a frantic, erratic rhythm against the ribs. With trembling fingers, the individual reaches for the glowing screen of a smartphone resting on the nightstand. They tap the icon of a banking application. The screen loads, spinning a digital wheel for an agonizing heartbeat before revealing the stark, unyielding digits of a dwindling balance, accompanied by a scarlet notification warning of an overdue liability. The natural, primal instinct of the human animal, in this precise sensory environment, is instantaneous and overwhelming flight. The breath catches in the throat, the eyes smart with a desire to squeeze shut, to hurl the phone across the room, to pull the heavy duvet back over the head, and to pretend that if the darkness is not looked upon, it ceases to exist. Millions of souls live their entire lives in this state of perpetual evasion, dancing around their problems, whispering around their debts, and avoiding the names of those who have broken their trust, believing that by refusing to gaze upon the monster, they are somehow keeping themselves safe from its jaws. To transcend this paralyzing impulse of evasion, one must deconstruct the psychological and philosophical architecture of fear through the penetrating lens of recursive thinking. Why does the human psyche instinctively recoil from looking directly at its own difficulties? Because the ego, built upon the brittle foundation of self-preservation, fears annihilation. It equates the acknowledgement of a painful reality with the confirmation of its own defeat. How does this avoidance maintain the tyranny of the burden over the individual's life? By surrendering the position of sovereign command to the circumstance itself. When a person turns their face away from a bill, a diagnosis, or a conflict, they are handing the reins of their reality over to the phantom. They are declaring, through their posture of cowardice, that the problem is too massive to be witnessed, too powerful to be named, and too holy in its terror to be questioned. Why did Florence Scovel Shinn insist that the very first step of spiritual liberation is the unblinking, direct look? Because, psychologically speaking, the lion derives its entire fierceness from the victim's panic. As long as a problem is treated as a shadowy, unspeakable phantom lurking just outside the peripheral vision of consciousness, it grows monstrous proportions in the dark theater of the imagination. How does the direct look dismantle this psychological tyranny? When an individual sits down with deliberate, unflinching courage, opens their eyes, and stares directly into the face of the crisis, reading every word of the foreclosure notice, saying the name of the betrayer out loud, acknowledging the precise weight of the debt, a profound alchemical shift occurs within the neurology of the brain. The amygdala's panic loop is interrupted by the prefrontal cortex's executive command. The abstract, terrifying monster is reduced to a finite set of numbers, words, and conditions. By looking at the burden squarely without flinching, the soul steps out of the helpless, reactive role of the hunted prey and steps directly into the exalted, detached posture of the cosmic observer. The illusion loses its sting the moment it is seen clearly in the light of day. It is no longer an executioner. It is merely a misplaced piece of a puzzle waiting to be rearranged by the master hand of infinite intelligence. In the winter of 1931, amidst the freezing winds of the Great Depression, a woman named Eleanor sat at her wooden kitchen table in a drafty apartment in Chicago. Before her lay a collection of menacing envelopes. Final eviction warnings. Utility cutoff. Notices and medical bills that seemed to multiply like shadows in a dark room. For weeks, Eleanor had practiced the art of terrified avoidance. When the mail carrier's heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, her breath would hitch, and she would freeze in silence until the footsteps passed, refusing to open the box. When she sat at the table, she would deliberately look past the stack of letters, trying to distract herself with cooking or reading, pretending the crushing reality outside her door did not exist. Yet, with every day of avoidance, the cold in the apartment grew deeper, the knot in her stomach tighter, and the shadow of ruin more suffocating. One evening, driven to the edge of utter despair by the silent terror of her own mind, Eleanor experienced a sudden, fierce flash of defiance. She realized that she was dying 1,000 deaths by running from paper and ink. With rigid resolve, she stood up, walked to the hallway, retrieved the unopened mail from the drop box, and brought every single bill, notice, and collection letter to the center of the kitchen table. She pulled up her chair, sat down straight and tall, and turned on the bright overhead light. Her hands trembled violently as she picked up the first eviction notice. Instead of gasping or crying as she had done 100 times before, she forced her eyes to trace every single line of the formal text. She read the numbers out loud, her voice shaking but resolute in the silent room. "You owe this amount," she read to the empty walls. "You are facing this consequence." She did the same for the utility bills, laying them out side by side, like soldiers on a battlefield. She looked at every single one of them with unblinking, steady eyes, refusing to let her gaze waver. As she stared down the terrifying figures, something miraculous happened inside her chest. The hot, suffocating panic that had choked her for months began to cool, replaced by a strange, crystalline clarity. The monsters on the paper lost their terrifying masks. They were no longer executioners sent to destroy her. They were merely quantitative facts, finite markers of an old state of consciousness that she had outgrown. Looking them straight in the eye without a shred of fear, Eleanor spoke her first word of power into the quiet room. She looked at the bills and said, "You are an appearance, but you are not a power. There is only one power, and that power is for me, not against me." In that singular, courageous moment of direct confrontation, the ammunition of the crisis was neutralized, and the door to her deliverance was cracked wide open. The practice of the direct look requires a supreme act of spiritual bravery, calling upon the seeker to abandon all forms of denial and intellectual cowardice. To embody this truth today, you must identify the one piece of news, the one financial statement, or the one difficult conversation that you have been avoiding out of fear. Stop running. Stop hiding behind distractions, busyness, or false hope. You are invited to schedule a sacred appointment with your reality today. Sit down in a quiet space. Bring the hidden burden out into the light of your conscious awareness, and look at it directly, without flinching, without judgment, and without panic. Confronting the burden with an unblinking eye is only the beginning of the alchemical process. Once the reality has been looked upon and stripped of its terror, what is the next precise mechanical step? How does the seeker take raw, chaotic lead and transmute it into shining gold? The answer opens wide the gateway to the second sacred protocol, the profound, transformative rite of the spiritual baptism. The atmosphere within an unawakened mind is heavy and stagnant, saturated with the foul odors of defeat and linguistic decay. Picture a damp, subterranean cellar where stagnant water pools in the dark corners, breeding rot and decay. In this mental basement, millions of human beings spend their days laboring under an invisible, self-imposed curse, armed only with a vocabulary of doom. They wake up in the morning and immediately invoke their afflictions with liturgical precision. They whisper into the mirror, "My arthritis is acting up again." They mutter across the breakfast table, "My business is failing, my bank account is bleeding, and my partner is impossible." Consider the profound, devastating paradox of human speech. Mankind uses words, the very instruments that ancient traditions declare possess the power of life and death, to staple themselves to their miseries. They baptize their children with hopes for greatness, yet they baptize their daily trials with titles of permanent destruction. Every time a person attaches the possessive pronoun of ownership to a catastrophe, calling it my debt, my illness, my betrayal, they are performing a dark, unconscious christening. They are pouring the water of emotional investment over an inharmonious event and giving it a formal name that their subconscious mind must respect, honor, and protect. The air in this cellar is thick with linguistic poison. The soul walks through life shackled by names it has assigned to its own prisons, never realizing that the iron bars are made of vocabulary, and the warden holding the key is none other than the speaker himself. To change the reality, the labels must be smashed, the baptismal waters must be reclaimed, and a new sovereign nomenclature must be spoken into the ether. To master the art of the spiritual baptism, one must subject the mechanics of language, thought, and subconscious programming to a rigorous, recursive philosophical deconstruction. Why does the subconscious mind faithfully manifest whatever title the conscious mind assigns to an event? Because the subconscious operates as an absolute, literal servant. It possesses no sense of humor, no critical faculty of irony, and no independent ability to distinguish between a temporary circumstance and an eternal truth. It accepts every repeated statement as a primary blueprint for construction. How does this linguistic programming dictate the trajectory of human destiny? Through the continuous cognitive filtering of reality, modern psychological science confirms what ancient metaphysical masters always knew. The human brain possesses a reticular activating system that acts as a gatekeeper, filtering millions of sensory inputs every second to match the core expectations, definitions, and identities the individual has accepted for themselves. If you name your condition chronic failure, your mind systematically ignores every subtle opening, opportunity, and golden link that contradicts that name, while hyper-focusing exclusively on evidence that proves your failure true. Why did Florence Scovel Shinn command her students to baptize every inharmonious situation with the name success? Because spiritual baptism is the supreme psychological act of cognitive reframing. It is the deliberate, calculated disruption of an old identity. How does this spiritual baptism achieve its alchemical transformation? When a child is baptized in sacred tradition, they are washed clean of their old state and given a new name, a new identity, and a new destiny to carry into the world. You must do precisely the same with your burdens. You must stand before your ledger of debt, your medical chart, or your fractured relationship, and perform a linguistic exorcism. You must strip away the old, toxic titles, my debt, my illness, my grief, and replace them with the royal nomenclature of the Spirit. You look at the debt and declare it the divine channel of infinite supply. You look at the physical weakness and name it the manifestation of divine rhythm and wholeness. This is not a game of semantic self-deception. It is the absolute spiritual logic of recreating your universe through the spoken word. By changing the name, you rewrite the instructions given to the faithful subconscious servant. You train your mind to look for opulence instead of lack, harmony instead of discord, and victory instead of defeat. The law of mind responds instantly to the new order, bending circumstances to fit the architecture of your spoken declarations. In the quiet suburbs of mid-century Boston, a man named Jonathan Calloway faced a physical and professional crisis that threatened to erase everything he had built. Following a severe corporate betrayal that cost him his position as lead engineer, Jonathan's body collapsed under the weight of chronic stress, manifesting as a debilitating but painful degeneration of his joints that left him bedridden for months. For the first 100 days, Jonathan's life was an unceasing litany of sorrowful christenings. Every visitor who entered his room was greeted with a detailed, sorrowful accounting of his misery. "My body is failing me," he would whisper, his voice trembling with self-pity. "My career is dead. My savings are gone. This arthritis is my permanent executioner." He baptized every ache with a name of doom, and his subconscious faithfully carried out the orders, locking his joints tighter and deepening his financial despair. One autumn afternoon, a visiting friend, an old student of Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings, sat quietly by Jonathan's bedside, listened to his endless recitation of woe, and laid a gentle hand upon his arm. "Jonathan," the friend said softly, "you are holding a wicked christening every single day. You are baptizing your failures in the waters of despair, and then you wonder why your soul drowns in them. You must stop naming your prisons. You must take up the waters of the Spirit and baptize your trials as your triumphs. Jonathan stared at his friend, stung by the candor, yet pierced to the core by a sudden, electric spark of truth. That evening, after his friend departed, Jonathan lay in the dark room, feeling the familiar, burning pain in his hands. The old impulse arose to whisper, "My pain." But instead of yielding, Jonathan bit his lip, summoned every ounce of his remaining willpower, and spoke aloud into the empty shadows. "No," he whispered fiercely to the dark. "You are not my pain. I baptize you as the divine purifier of my strength. I baptize this forced stillness as a sacred incubation of genius. I baptize my empty bank account as the active field of infinite supply." He did it again, and then again. Whenever the pain flared, he renamed it. Whenever a bill arrived, he christened it the golden seed of an incoming harvest. It felt unnatural at first, and a strange theater played against the cold walls of his bedroom, but Jonathan persisted with the stubborn discipline of a man fighting for his life. Within 3 weeks of this radical linguistic transformation, the internal shift began to register on the outer plane. The physical inflammation in his joints, starved of the mental resistance and toxic naming that had sustained it, began to subside into a manageable, fading memory. Simultaneously, a former colleague who had not spoken to him in years mysteriously appeared at his door with an invitation to partner on a groundbreaking independent engineering patent that required precisely Jonathan's specialized expertise. The old life had been washed away not by medicine or luck, but by the sovereign power of a new baptism. The power of life and death resides not in the outer circumstances of your existence, but in the tongue that names them. To embody this truth today, you must audit your vocabulary with the precision of a master surgeon. Examine the labels you have assigned to your current struggles. Stop calling your challenges by names of permanent ruin. You are invited to perform your own spiritual baptism in this very hour. Take the single heaviest burden in your life, whether it is an empty wallet, a broken bond, or a faltering project, and strip away its old, toxic title. Speak a new, exalted name over it out loud, claiming it as a channel of divine success. If this chapter has broken the chains of your vocabulary and opened your eyes to the creative power of your speech, take a moment to hit like and subscribe to anchor this new frequency into your daily walk and ensure you do not miss the next ascension of your mastery. Renaming the burden and baptizing the trial is a monumental leap toward freedom, but the forces of adversity often strike back with malicious intent. When an adversary or a circumstance actively attempts to harm you, how do you meet the attack without lowering yourself to their level of combat? The answer lies waiting in the third sacred protocol, the alchemical art of robbing the enemy's ammunition through the shield of absolute goodwill. The sudden snap of a bowstring in a silent wood carries a specific, cold terror, echoing through the air long before the shaft hits its mark. Picture a man standing at the center of a sunlit courtyard, surrounded by high stone walls. Without warning, a sharp, metallic whistle cuts through the peace. An arrow, tipped with the bitter gall of malice, flies over the rampart, aimed directly at his heart. The natural, unthinking reflex of the human animal in this precise sensory environment is immediate retaliation. The blood rushes to the temples, the fists clench, the jaw locks, and the instinctive desire to reach for a bow of one's own to return venom for venom, insult for insult, and blow for blow burns like liquid fire in the veins. Consider the profound paradox of human conflict. When an adversary launches an attack against you, whether through a malicious public slander, a calculated professional betrayal, or a cruel, targeted whisper designed to undermine your character, they are not merely throwing a weapon, they are casting a line into the turbulent waters of your emotions. They expect you to bite. They expect you to step down from your sovereign platform, enter the mud of their lower vibration, and meet them eye to eye in the trenches of bitterness. Most of humanity falls headlong into this trap every single day. They match malice with matching malice, believing that self-defense requires an equal and opposite explosion of rage. But Florence Scovel Shinn revealed a secret law of spiritual physics that shatters this conventional warfare. If you bless your enemy, you rob him of his ammunition. To To understand this law is to realize that the adversary cannot harm you with his arrows unless you willingly provide the target, the landing pad, and the emotional fuel that gives his attack its devastating kinetic force. To master the high art of neutralizing an attack through goodwill, one must subject the psychological and philosophical mechanics of interpersonal conflict to a rigorous, recursive deconstruction. Why do human beings instinctively believe that returning anger for anger is the only effective form of self-defense? Because the ego operates entirely on the primitive law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It assumes that power is measured by the volume of one's scream and the ferocity of one's counterattack. How does this retaliatory impulse actually surrender all power directly to the attacker? When an individual responds to malice with resentment, anger, or a desire for revenge, they perform a catastrophic energetic descent. They cross the threshold and step directly into the attacker's camp. They stand on the exact same psychological and spiritual level as the enemy. Why does standing on that level render the individual completely vulnerable to harm? Because when two minds occupy the same frequency of hostility, they share a closed circuit of destructive energy. The attacker's arrows require that specific frequency of friction to find their mark. If you meet an attack with hatred, you provide the exact metallic target that the arrow is engineered to pierce. How does blessing the enemy short-circuit this entire mechanism? When someone hurls malice toward you, and you respond not with resistance or counterattack, but with an absolute, unyielding projection of unconditional goodwill, declaring silently, "I bless you. I see you as harmonious and just in the divine mind," you instantly step out of their camp. You ascend to a higher dimension of consciousness, where the laws of lower combat do not apply. Philosophically speaking, this is a literal robbery. The attacker's ammunition consists entirely of your anticipated reaction. They have manufactured their arrows out of your expected anger, your predictable bitterness, and your forthcoming defense. When you refuse to react with hostility, when you bathe their attack in the solvent of goodwill, their arrows are instantly stripped of their weight. The iron heads turn to lead, the shafts turn to dust, and the weapons literally fall harmlessly to the ground at your feet. Better yet, under the pristine law of spiritual reversal, those neutralized arrows are transmuted into golden links of unexpected blessings that elevate you higher than you were before the attack began. In the bustling administrative offices of a historic publishing house in London during the early 1920s, a dedicated editor named Clara found herself the target of a vicious, calculated campaign of sabotage. A newly appointed junior executive, driven by ruthless ambition and a desire to usurp Clara's department leadership, began systematically undermining her work. He altered her printing schedules without her knowledge, intercepted her communications, and planted malicious rumors about her competence among the senior partners. For the first few weeks, Clara experienced the searing, white-hot urge to strike back. She drafted scathing memos exposing his treachery. She rehearsed sharp, cutting retorts to deliver in board meetings. She lay awake at night plotting how to expose his dishonesty to the board of directors. Every time she thought of him, her chest tightened with a suffocating mixture of rage and wounded pride. Yet, every countermove she planned seemed to bog her down deeper in political mud, while the executive's attacks grew bolder and more damaging. One evening, while walking home through the misty London fog, Clara happened upon a worn copy of Florence Scovel Shinn's writings in a small antiquarian bookstore window. Her eyes caught a single sentence printed on an open page: "Bless your enemy, and you rob him of his ammunition." The words struck her soul like a lightning bolt. She realized that she had been playing the executive's game by his own rules, firing arrows of resentment that only fed the toxic atmosphere of the office. Standing under a flickering gas lamp on the damp pavement, Clara made a profound, terrifying choice. She decided to lay down her weapons entirely. The next morning, Clara walked into the office enveloped in an unshakable inner calm. When the junior executive passed her desk and offered a cold, sarcastic remark designed to provoke her, Clara did not bristle or snap. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes with a warm, genuine smile, and silently sent a wave of powerful goodwill straight into his troubled spirit. In the quiet sanctuary of her mind, she declared, "I bless the divine in you. I release you from my condemnation, and I see you operating under grace and divine justice. She repeated this silent blessing every single time he attempted an act of sabotage. When he intercepted her memos, she blessed him. When he spoke ill of her to the partners, she sent him goodwill instead of counter-arguments. She completely neutralized her own resistance, stepping entirely out of his camp. Within a fortnight, the dynamic shifted with astonishing speed. Deprived of the friction and anger he needed to sustain his attacks, the executive's hostility lost its momentum. His erratic behavior began to draw the critical eye of the senior partners, not because Clara complained, but because his own inner turmoil became glaringly obvious in the absence of her resistance. Within a month, he was quietly dismissed from the firm for professional misconduct, while the directors, recognizing Clara's unshakable grace and poise throughout the ordeal, promoted her to senior vice president of the division. The arrows of malice had not touched her, they had simply dissolved into nothingness. The mastery of self-defense does not lie in the accumulation of weapons, but in the total abandonment of retaliation through the absolute shield of goodwill. To embody this truth today, you must examine every relationship or professional conflict where you feel targeted, misunderstood, or wronged. Stop preparing your counter-arguments. Stop rehearsing your grievances in the theater of your mind. You are invited to practice the immediate disarmament of your adversaries today. When you feel the sting of someone's criticism or witness an act of unfairness directed at your life, do not meet it with the fires of resentment. Step out of their camp entirely. Send them your quiet, powerful goodwill. Neutralizing the enemy's arrows through goodwill is an extraordinary triumph, but spiritual law demands that faith be proven through physical action. How does the seeker seal their demonstration on the material plane? What is the physical posture required to anchor a miracle into reality? The answer opens the gateway to the fourth sacred protocol, the active, tangible art of digging ditches. The afternoon sun beats down mercilessly upon a cracked, parched valley floor where the soil has turned to gray dust, baked hard by months of absolute drought. In the center of this desolate expanse stands a man who claims to possess deep, unshakable faith in an impending downpour. He raises his hands to the cloudless, blinding sky, chanting high incantations of abundance, declaring with passionate fervor that the heavens are about to open and restore his barren land. Yet, as evening approaches and the temperature begins to drop, he retreats to his porch, sits in his rocking chair, and continues to eye the dry, dusty earth around his homestead with quiet, lingering panic. He has spoken the words of faith, but he has left his fields untouched, his storage bins empty, and his ground unprepared for a single drop of water. Consider the profound paradox of human expectation. Millions of seekers sit in the quiet sanctuaries of their minds, repeating high affirmations, visualizing prosperity, and speaking words of power, yet their physical lives remain completely stagnant. Why? Because they separate their mental decrees from physical action. They pray for a harvest, but they refuse to touch a plow. They declare their faith in a miraculous supply, yet they hoard their pennies, refuse to make space in their closets for new clothing, and live every moment of their lives as if scarcity is their permanent, inescapable address. Faith without works is not merely incomplete, it is an abstraction, a ghost that haunts the ether without anchoring its feet in the rich soil of the material world. Florence Scovel Shinn taught an immutable law of manifestation that cuts straight through this spiritual lethargy. You must act as if you have already received. Before the rain can fall from the invisible heights of heaven, the seeker must reach for the shovel and dig their ditches in the dry earth. To master the mechanical art of digging ditches, one must subject the psychology of active expectation to a rigorous, recursive philosophical deconstruction. Why does the human mind struggle so intensely to align its physical behavior with its spiritual declarations? Because the ego is fundamentally bound to sensory proof. It operates on the empirical rule of seeing is believing. When the bank account reads zero or the physical environment displays lack, the ego panics, demanding that physical reality change first before the body, the hands, or the wallet are permitted to move in response. How does this reliance on sensory proof paralyze the manifestation of new realities? By locking the individual into a closed loop of repetitive limitation. If you wait until you see the money before you prepare to spend it wisely, or wait until you feel entirely well before you plan an active future, you are bowing down to appearances. You are making outer circumstances your master rather than your servant. Why did Florence Scovel Shinn insist that digging ditches is the indispensable final step of every spiritual protocol? Because physical preparation is the ultimate language of subconscious conviction. The subconscious mind does not understand vague longings or polite requests. It responds exclusively to emotional intensity and physical demonstration. How does digging a ditch alter the chemical and energetic architecture of manifestation? When you perform a physical act that proves you believe your prayer has already been answered, such as buying a travel trunk when you have no money for a ticket, or purchasing a single beautiful item to signify your prosperity when your funds are low, you send an electrical shock of certainty through your entire nervous system. You signal to every atom in the atmosphere and every cell in your biology that the manifestation is a finished, established fact in the invisible realm. Philosophically speaking, the ditch is not created to cause the rain, the ditch is created to receive the rain. The heavens do not withhold water because the ground is dry. The heavens wait for the ground to make ready for the blessing. When you pick up the shovel and break the hard earth of your current limitation, you are declaring to infinite intelligence that you are ready, expectant, and fully prepared to house the abundance that is already rushing toward you from the unseen dimensions of the spirit. In the autumn of 1928, in a modest flat overlooking the grey riverbanks of London, a man named Arthur found himself trapped in a profound financial labyrinth. He had spent months studying the spiritual laws of prosperity, repeating decrees of abundance, and visualizing a transformative journey across the Atlantic to secure a vital publishing contract that would rescue his family from ruin. Yet, weeks bled into months, and no money materialized. His savings were entirely depleted. His pockets were empty, and the dream of the voyage seemed nothing more than a cruel phantom of the imagination. One afternoon, weary of his own passive waiting, Arthur happened to attend a quiet lecture where the teachings of Florence Scovel Shinn were discussed. The speaker looked directly into the audience and uttered a sentence that pierced Arthur's soul. "You are praying for a journey, but you haven't bought a trunk. Where is your ditch? Why are you asking for a harvest when you haven't cleared a single foot of ground to hold it?" Arthur walked home through the damp evening air, his mind churning with the weight of those words. He realized that for all his high-sounding affirmations, he had continued to live like a pauper. He expected the universe to drop a miracle into a life entirely unready to receive it. He had not prepared a single space for the change he was demanding. The next morning, with a heart pounding against his ribs in a mixture of terror and fierce resolve, Arthur did something that shocked his own rational senses. He walked down to a small second-hand luggage shop on the corner of the cobblestone street. With the very last coins he possessed, money that should have been spent on his evening meal, he purchased a sturdy, brown leather traveling trunk. It was an absurd, terrifying purchase. He had no ticket, no ship passage, and not a single penny left in his pocket for the morrow. As he dragged the heavy leather trunk back up the stairs to his cramped flat and placed it squarely in the middle of his tiny parlor, a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "What have I done?" whispered the voice of doubt. "This is madness." Yet, the moment the trunk touched the floorboards, a profound click occurred within Arthur's consciousness. The frantic anxiety that had choked him for months vanished, replaced by an immovable, quiet peace. He unpacked his old wardrobe, folded his garments neatly, and placed them inside the trunk. He even packed his shaving kit, acting with absolute, unwavering precision as a man preparing to board a ship the following week. He had dug his ditch. 3 days later, an unexpected letter arrived in the post. A distant literary acquaintance, whom Arthur had not seen in 5 years, wrote to inform him that an anonymous investor in New York had read an obscure essay Arthur had written years prior and had deposited a substantial advance into a London bank account, specifically earmarked to fund Arthur's immediate travel across the Atlantic for a publishing collaboration. The funds covered the exact cost of the journey, down to the final shilling. The rain had rushed into the ditch the moment the earth was broken, faith, without physical works, is a sterile seed planted in unplowed ground. To embody this truth today, you must examine your life for the missing ditches. Where are you praying for a breakthrough while continuing to prepare for failure? Where are you asking for supply while hoarding your resources out of fear? You are invited to take one tangible, physical action today that proves to the universe you believe your demonstration is already accomplished. Go out and buy the small item, clear out the drawer for the new partner, or organize your desk for the incoming enterprise. Digging the ditch seals the demonstration in the physical plane, but life is a continuous stream of unexpected interruptions, sudden crises, and sudden phone calls that test the sovereign peace of the seeker. How does one maintain this mastery when the outer world descends into sudden chaos? The answer lies waiting in the seventh sacred protocol, the real-time alchemy of everyday crises. The studio of a master clockmaker is filled with the frantic, discordant ticking of 1,000 gears, weights, and escapements, but in the center of the room stands a man whose instrument has suddenly jammed. Picture a quiet, sunlit afternoon disrupted by the harsh, abrasive screech of a telephone wire going dead. A sudden, absolute silence where a vital connection was meant to be. The individual waiting for that call stiffens instantly. The breath catches in the throat. The eyes lock onto the heavy black receiver resting on its cradle, and a dark, rising tide of panic begins to flood the chambers of the heart. Consider the paradox of human control in the face of an unexpected interruption. The moment a crisis occurs, whether it is an abrupt disconnection, a sudden financial freeze, or a delayed message upon which an entire career hangs, the unawakened human animal lunges forward with frantic willpower. They grip the edges of the desk, they curse the wires. They refuse to let anyone else near the instrument. They attempt to bully, manipulate, and force the physical universe into compliance through sheer, muscular exertion of ego. Yet, the more violently they try to manage the machinery of their lives with human hands, the more tangled the threads become. They create an absolute eclipse of their own good through the sheer density of their anxiety. They become like a drowning swimmer who fights the water so viciously that they pull the very weight of the ocean down into their lungs. They forget that peace is not achieved by wrestling the storm, but by stepping outside the storm entirely and recognizing the divine order that hums silently beneath the chaos. To master the real-time alchemy of everyday crises, one must subject the psychological mechanics of panic and surrender to a rigorous, recursive philosophical breakdown. Why does the human mind instantly default to frantic manipulation when an unexpected crisis shatters its plans? Because the ego identifies completely with the machinery of time and space. It believes that if it does not micromanage every minute detail of existence, the entire universe will collapse into ruin. How does this frantic human effort sabotage the very outcome the individual desires? By creating an energetic bottleneck. When a person infuses a crisis with fear, anger, and obsessive control, they build a dense wall of resistance between themselves and the invisible supply of infinite intelligence. They treat the universe like an adversary that must be outsmarted, rather than an infinitely responsive field that mirrors their inner state. Why did Florence Scovel Shinn teach that the shift from the human level of struggle to the divine level of recognition is the ultimate turning point of mastery? Because on the human level, everything is a battle of conflicting wills, heavy labor, and frustrating delays. On the divine level, everything is already established, perfectly coordinated, and waiting to be claimed through silent recognition. How does the alchemical shift occur in the middle of an emergency? When an unexpected crisis strikes, instead of tightening the grip of human control, the master seeker opens their hands, steps back from the switchboard of their life, and instantly baptizes the disruption as success. They declare that no good thing can be withheld from them by divine right. Philosophically speaking, this is the moment where human willpower surrenders to divine law. The moment the seeker stops fighting the disconnection, whether it is a disconnected phone line, a canceled contract, or a blocked pathway, infinite intelligence immediately moves mountains, marshals unseen forces, and rearranges human hearts to clear the channel. The crisis is not an obstacle preventing the miracle. The crisis is the raw material, the very canvas upon which the miracle is painted. In the spring of 1925, Florence Scovel Shinn herself found her morning schedule thrown into absolute turmoil by a frustrating, seemingly trivial mechanical failure. She was sitting in her New York apartment, waiting for a series of vitally important telephone calls regarding an upcoming public lecture series that would determine the reach of her spiritual work for the entire year. As the appointed hour approached, she noticed a heavy, oppressive silence. She lifted the receiver of her telephone, only to discover that the line was completely dead. The local telephone exchange was undergoing sudden maintenance, and her instrument had been disconnected for over an hour without warning. For the first few minutes, the human instinct of frustration flared within her. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She considered rushing down to the lobby, demanding answers from the building superintendent, and pacing the floor in anxiety over the missed connections that were slipping away with every passing second. Suddenly, Florence caught herself in the middle of her mental scramble. She stopped pacing, smiled at her own momentary lapse into human struggle, and executed the sovereign shift. She put down the receiver, walked to the center of the room, and spoke her word of power into the quiet space. "I cannot lose any call that belongs to me by divine right," she declared aloud, her voice resonant and calm. "I baptize this disconnection as success. Infinite intelligence is operating here, and my own comes to me under grace." Instead of fighting the telephone company or fuming over the lost time, she turned her attention entirely away from the instrument and began organizing her papers with absolute peace, acting as if the lines were already humming with activity. Within 10 minutes of her mental surrender, a complete stranger, a delivery man who had no business entering her specific hallway, knocked on her door to drop off a misplaced parcel for a neighbor. Seizing the moment with divine poise, Florence asked the man if he would use his pocket toolkit to check the main junction box in the basement stairwell, explaining her predicament with warm goodwill. The man willingly obliged, descended to the basement, and discovered a loose wire that had accidentally been severed by a maintenance crew. Within minutes, the line was reconnected. As she walked back into her study, the telephone bell began to ring instantly, delivering every single essential call without a single interruption. The moment she stopped resisting the blackout and blessed it, infinite intelligence moved mountains to restore her connection. Every unexpected interruption, every technical failure, and every sudden delay is not a roadblock. It is an invitation to step out of human struggle and into divine recognition. To embody this truth today, you must monitor your reactions to the small, everyday annoyances that threaten to steal your peace. Stop fighting the traffic, the slow computer, or the unexpected phone call. You are invited to practice real-time alchemy the very next time your day is disrupted. Do not tense or curse the circumstance. Pause, take a breath, and instantly baptize the disruption as an opening for divine perfection. Navigating everyday crises with alchemical grace prepares the soul for the ultimate test of sovereignty. But what happens when the midnight hours descend, and the dark, whispering voices of doubt attempt to erode the inner climate of the soul? The answer opens the gateway to the 8th sacred protocol, mastering the inner climate. The witching hour of midnight descends upon the sleeping city like a heavy, starless cloak, wrapping the world in an absolute, suffocating silence. Inside a solitary room, a woman sits upright in her bed, staring into the impenetrable darkness. The house is completely still, yet within the sanctuary of her own mind, a ferocious gale is howling. It is the dark, whispering voice of the midnight hour, that insidious phantom of isolation that creeps into the chambers of the soul when the distractions of the day have faded away. The voice whispers of abandonment. It reminds her of every project that stalled, every relationship that fractured, and every critical word spoken against her by those who swore loyalty. It paints a vivid, terrifying portrait of a universe that is cold, indifferent, and hostile, leaving her to wonder why she has been passed over, forgotten, and left to fend for herself against the rising tides of economic uncertainty and physical decline. Consider the profound paradox of human consciousness in this sensory environment. The outer world is entirely harmless. No physical enemy stands at her door. No immediate catastrophe threatens her limbs, and the room is safe and warm. Yet, she is battered, bruised, and bleeding internally from storms manufactured entirely within her own mental atmosphere. Most of humanity lives its entire existence as a slave to this inner weather. They allow the shifting winds of public opinion, economic forecasts, and personal slights to dictate whether their internal climate is one of radiant sunshine or torrential despair. They wait passively for the world to become kind, gentle, and accommodating before they permit themselves to feel secure, completely unaware that they hold within their own breast the sovereign authority to create their own climate, melting the ice of their own obstacles with the pure heat of the spirit. To master the inner climate and conquer the whispering voices of the midnight hour, one must subject the psychological and philosophical mechanics of emotional sovereignty to a rigorous, recursive deconstruction. Why does the human soul instinctively surrender control of its internal atmosphere to external weather patterns? Because the unawakened consciousness has been conditioned to act as a thermometer rather than a thermostat. A thermometer merely registers the temperature of the room, reacting passively to whatever heat or cold the environment provides. How does this passive psychological conditioning perpetuate a state of perpetual victimization? By keeping the individual locked in a cycle of dependency. If your peace of mind depends upon the stock market remaining stable, your spouse remaining cheerful, and your neighbors remaining kind, you are living as a beggar at the gates of circumstance. You have surrendered your crown to the whims of a chaotic world. Why did Florence Scovel Shinn teach that a human being is not a survivor of life's hardships, but a sovereign creator endowed with royal authority? Because the kingdom of heaven is truly within. The soul does not need the world to be kind before it can experience harmony. It can generate its own climate through the deliberate, unyielding command of the spoken word. How does the transition from thermometer to thermostat occur within the architecture of the mind? Through the absolute realization that no person, no bank, no germ, and no circumstance can touch the sovereign integrity of an individual who knows how to rule their own spirit. When the dark, whispering voices arise in the night, the master seeker does not cower or plead for mercy. They stand upright in consciousness, draw upon the long arm of the infinite, and declare their dominion over the mental atmosphere. Philosophically speaking, mastering the inner climate is the art of becoming the sun. When the winter frost of adversity tries to freeze your hopes, you do not argue with the frost, you simply radiate more light. You anchor your awareness so deeply in the divine reality that outer storms break against your peace like waves crashing against an immovable cliff of ancient stone. In the winter of 1918, in a drafty Victorian home in upstate New York, a woman named Margaret lived in a state of continuous psychological siege. Her tormentor did not live across town, she lived down the hall. Margaret's mother, an elderly woman of sharp tongue and bitter disposition, subjected her daughter to a relentless daily barrage of criticism, manipulation, and emotional cruelty. For 10 long years, Margaret had acted as a thermometer. Every harsh word her mother uttered plunged Margaret's internal climate into a deep, freezing winter of depression and self-doubt. She tried everything to change her mother. She argued, she pleaded, she explained, she wept, and she attempted to mold herself into whatever shape would please the older woman. Yet, the criticism only grew sharper, and Margaret's spirit withered under the constant, icy drizzle of hostility. One evening, after a particularly brutal verbal assault at the dinner table, Margaret fled to her bedroom, locked the door, and collapsed onto her bed in a torrent of exhausted tears. The midnight hours rolled in, bringing that familiar, whispering voice of despair telling her that she was trapped, broken, and helpless. As she lay there in the dark, her eyes fell upon a small, leather-bound volume of Florence Scovel Shinn's essays resting on her bedside table, a gift from a distant aunt that she had never truly read. With trembling fingers, she opened to a marked page where the ink seemed to leap out at her. You cannot change another person by fighting them, because resistance locks the pattern in place. You must rise to the high mountain of your own consciousness. Bless the divine in your difficult relationship, and watch the outer image dissolve as the inner climate shifts. A profound, electrifying realization washed over Margaret. She had spent a decade trying to fix the thermometer instead of adjusting the thermostat. She sat up straight in the bed, wiped the tears from her cheeks, and made a radical, sovereign decision. She brought her mother's image into the light of her mind, but instead of seeing her as a tormentor, she stripped away the mask of bitterness. She began to speak quiet, powerful decrees into the empty room. "I bless the divine in my mother," Margaret whispered, her voice gaining strength with every repetition. "I see her as a golden link in the chain of my spiritual evolution. There is no criticism in divine mind, and all friction between us is now dissolved under grace." She repeated this decree for an hour, refusing to let the old mental weather return. Whenever the bitter memory of her mother's words tried to creep back in, Margaret turned up the heat of her goodwill and flooded the mental space with light. The transformation on the outer plane was nothing short of miraculous. Within 3 short weeks of Margaret maintaining this unshakable inner climate, her mother's entire personality began to shift. The sharp, critical remarks grew fewer and farther between, eventually ceasing altogether. Within 2 months, the mother, unprompted by any human argument, apologized for her years of harshness, expressing a sudden, deep affection and transforming into a warm, supportive presence in Margaret's daily life. The external storm had melted away because Margaret had finally become the sun. The mastery of your existence depends entirely upon your refusal to let outer weather dictate your inner climate. To embody this truth today, you must examine the areas of your life where you have been acting like a thermometer, reacting bitterly to the coldness of others or the harshness of your environment. Stop waiting for the world to warm up before you allow yourself to shine. You are invited to take sovereign control of your internal atmosphere today. When the whispering voices of doubt or the chilly winds of criticism attempt to invade your peace, do not fight them with arguments. Simply radiate your light, anchor your word in the divine, and become the thermostat of your reality. Mastering the inner climate prepares the soul for the ultimate dissolution of hard, crystallized structures of lack and fear that have lingered for lifetimes. What happens when these ancient structures finally break open? What lies waiting on the other side of the dissolving wall? The answer opens the gateway to the 9th sacred protocol, the dissolution of the hardened structures. Deep within the subterranean vaults of an ancient citadel, far below the reach of sunlight and seasonal winds, stands a colossal wall of dark, unyielding granite. For centuries, this massive stone has remained crystallized, cold, and utterly impervious to the soft, rhythmic dripping of water from the vault above. To the uninitiated observer standing in the damp shadows, this barrier appears as permanent as the earth itself, an immovable decree of limitation, a solid architecture of lack that bars passage from the narrow corridors of human struggle into the vast, open gardens of the sovereign realm. Men and women have walked down this subterranean passage for generations, bruised their hands against its rough surface, and wept at its cold base, convinced that stone is eternal and that walls of lack can never be dissolved. Consider the profound, paradoxical nature of crystallized structures within human experience. Mankind spends lifetimes trying to hammer away at long-term debts, chronic patterns of failure, and hardened states of lack as if they were solid granite. They bring iron chisels of willpower, heavy hammers of worry, and explosive charges of resentment to break open their financial and emotional prisons. Yet, the harder they strike the stone, the more entrenched the barrier feels. They fail to recognize a fundamental truth of universal physics. Granite is not destroyed by brute force. It is transformed by a solvent far more powerful than stone. Florence Scovel Shinn understood that a spiritual blessing acts as a chemical solvent of the soul. When applied with quiet determination, a blessing does not merely dent the wall, it dissolves the hard, crystallized structures of lack and fear entirely, turning ancient barriers into a gentle mist that vanishes into the dawn. To master the sacred science of dissolving hardened structures, one must subject the psychology of long-term habits and financial stagnation to a rigorous, recursive philosophical breakdown. Why do long-standing burdens and chronic lack feel so permanent and indestructible to the human mind? Because the subconscious has spent years, sometimes decades, laying down heavy layers of crystallized neural pathways, reinforcing the belief that scarcity is a fixed law of physical reality. How does this crystallized programming maintain its iron grip over the individual's destiny? Through the continuous, automatic reinforcement of the ego's fear loops. When a person looks at a debt that has lingered for 5 years, or an illness that has tracked their lineage for generations, the mind treats that longevity as proof of solidity. It whispers that time equals permanence, convincing the seeker that what has been heavy for long must remain heavy forever. Why did Florence Scovel Shinn teach that a blessing acts as a spiritual solvent rather than a battering ram? Because a solvent works by altering the chemical cohesion of a substance, breaking the bonds of molecular tension without requiring physical violence. How does the spiritual solvent of a blessing achieve the dissolution of hardened lack? When an individual stops fighting their long-term condition and instead bathes it in the high-frequency fluid of a blessing, repeatedly declaring their abundance, divine order, and release it, they introduce a new chemical element into the mental atmosphere. The blessing disrupts the crystallized structures of fear. Philosophically speaking, outer delays, temporary messes, and the chaotic breaking apart of old structures are not signs of failure, they are the absolute proof of the solvent at work. When a chemical solvent touches hardened salt, the salt does not instantly vanish. It first breaks down into a messy, turbulent slurry before it dissolves entirely into clear water. When your life begins to feel messy or unsettled after you speak your word, do not panic. Do not dig up your seeds to check if they are growing. The mess is simply the old derelicts of your subconscious rising to the surface to be put out forever. In the winter of 1932, during the deepest trough of the economic depression, an entrepreneur named Harrison found himself trapped behind a wall of crystallized bankruptcy. For 4 agonizing years, a massive, accumulated commercial debt hung over his head like an iron ceiling. His manufacturing business had folded. His personal credit had been pulverized, and legal judgments against him had hardened into a dense, unyielding structure of financial ruin that felt as permanent as the granite vaults of Wall Street. For years, Harrison had tried to shatter the wall with human force. He had worked 20-hour days, borrowed from reluctant relatives, begged creditors for extensions, and drowned his nights in bitter calculations of despair. Every effort only added another layer of concrete to his prison. He was utterly exhausted, convinced that his life was permanently sealed beneath the rubble of past failures. One evening, a tattered pamphlet containing the foundational laws of Florence Scovel Shinn found its way into his hands. His eyes caught a single revolutionary paragraph. The dry, crystallized structures of lack are dissolved by the solvent of praise and blessing. Do not fight the debt, baptize the situation as divine abundance, and watch the walls melt into their native nothingness. Harrison stared at the words, his mind rebelling against their simplicity. Bless a bankruptcy? Praise an avalanche of debt? Yet, he had tried every weapon in the human arsenal, and every weapon had broken in his hands. With a mixture of desperate exhaustion and radical surrender, Harrison sat down at his empty wooden desk, opened his ledger of liabilities, and made a sacred vow. Instead of cursing the red ink, he placed his hand flat upon the ledger and whispered his new baptismal decree into the silent room. I bless this debt, Harrison said, his voice steadying with every repetition. You are not a wall, you are raw material for divine alchemy. I dissolve you with the solvent of infinite supply. I baptize this ledger as the open channel of divine opulence. He repeated this daily, refusing to look at the mounting legal notices with terror, treating every reminder of lack as a phantom, dissolving in the sun. Within 3 weeks of this radical shift, the crystallized structures of his life began to break apart in ways he could never have engineered. The chaos was initially terrifying. 2 of his former creditors filed aggressive motions that forced his dormant corporate assets into a mandatory court restructuring. But under the guidance of a newly appointed judge who favored fair rehabilitation over punitive liquidation, those very assets were unshackled from old liens, and an unexpected angel investor investor, attracted by the sudden legal clarity of the restructured assets, stepped forward with a major capital injection. The ancient wall of debt did not fall because Harrison broke it. It dissolved completely into a clear stream of new enterprise, leaving him standing on the other side, completely free. Hardened structures of lack and fear cannot withstand the persistent, solvent power of a sovereign blessing. To embody this truth today, you must examine the oldest, most crystallized problems in your life, those stubborn areas of lack or limitation that you have given up on changing. You are invited to take your oldest, deepest burden today and apply the spiritual solvent. Stop hammering at the stone. Bathe the situation in continuous, quiet blessing, trusting the subterranean chemistry of the subconscious mind to dissolve the barrier completely. If this chapter has shattered your illusions of permanent lack and unlocked the chemistry of spiritual alchemy, take a moment to hit like and subscribe to lock this frequency into your daily walk and ensure you do not miss the grand, triumphant return of the sovereign soul in the final chapter. The dissolution of hardened walls clears the path for the ultimate realization of personal mastery. What happens when the iron doors swing wide open and the sovereign steps out into a completely transformed landscape? The journey reaches its majestic culmination in the 10th and final protocol, the sovereign's return. The morning mist rolls away from the valley floor like a giant, silver curtain lifting from a grand theatrical stage, revealing a landscape utterly transformed. Picture a sovereign ruler walking quietly through a realm that was once a desolate wasteland of jagged stones, tangled thorns, and towering iron gates. Where cold, impassable barriers once stood, golden sunlight now streams across open emerald meadows. The heavy doors have vanished. The arrows of malice lie broken and harmless in the dust, and every crooked pathway has been effortlessly straightened by an invisible, master hand. The air is warm, crisp, and charged with the electric promise of an eternal dawn. The individual who walks this path is no longer a hunted target ducking behind shields of frantic defense, nor a weeping beggar pleading at locked thresholds. They walk with quiet, royal grace, their head held high, completely untouched by the echoes of past skirmishes. Consider the profound paradox of this final realization. The world tells humanity that survival requires an unending war, a lifetime of building thicker walls, sharpening deadlier weapons, and striking back with vengeance against every slight. Yet, the sovereign discovers that the battle was never fought against external enemies, hostile banks, or cruel neighbors. The entire theater of struggle was merely a shadow play cast upon the wall of an unawakened mind. When the seeker stops fighting the reflection, unblinks before the mirror, baptizes their trials with high names, robs their adversaries through absolute goodwill, digs their ditches in faith, masters their inner climate, and dissolves every crystallized wall with the solvent of blessing, the outer world undergoes a silent, miraculous transfiguration. The iron door opens of its own accord. The kingdom is restored. The sovereign has returned to the throne of consciousness. To comprehend the profound philosophy of the sovereign's return, one must subject the final integration of spiritual law to a rigorous, recursive deconstruction. Why does the unawakened soul spend lifetimes wandering in the wilderness of victimhood before reclaiming its divine inheritance? Because the ego must exhaust every illusion of separate control. It must test every weapon of human retaliation, every strategy of clever manipulation, and every tear of self-pity until it realizes the absolute emptiness of struggle. How does the realization of true sovereignty liberate the individual from the cycles of karma and lack? By dissolving the dualistic belief in powers opposed to the divine. When an individual fully comprehends that infinite intelligence is a responsive, living presence that operates strictly according to the orders of human consciousness, the illusion of external tyranny collapses. Why is victory established in the invisible long before it manifests on the physical plane? Because the material world is nothing more than a lagging shadow cast by the permanent realities of the spiritual realm. As Florence Scovel Shinn constantly reminded her students, man only manifests what he secretly pictures or expects, for his imagination is his workshop. How does the sovereign maintain this permanent state of dominion amidst a changing world? Through the unshakable discipline of the spoken word and the silent sanctuary of inner peace, the sovereign does not react to news headlines, economic downturns, or human insults. They understand that they are not victims of a hard life, but master architects of an unfolding masterpiece. Philosophically speaking, the return of the sovereign marks the end of friction. When you know that every crooked place is being made straight, that every enemy is a golden link, and that every burden is raw material for a miracle, you stop forcing your life to happen. You allow infinite intelligence to flow through you with effortless, majestic precision. The struggle is over. The crown rests securely upon your brow, and the kingdom infinite, abundant, and free is yours forever. In the late autumn of 1940, in a quiet stone cottage overlooking the rugged cliffs of Cornwall, an elderly woman named Eleanor Vance sat by a tall, arched window, looking out over the roaring Atlantic Ocean. Decades earlier, she had been a frantic, debt-ridden seeker drowning in the harsh currents of the Great Depression, bruised by the world, and terrified of tomorrow. Through a lifetime of practicing the rigorous protocols of Florence Scovel Shinn, looking directly at her fears, baptizing her trials as success, robbing her enemies of ammunition through absolute goodwill, digging her ditches in faith, and ruling her inner climate like a monarch, she had systematically dismantled every wall of limitation that had ever hemmed her in. On this particular afternoon, a young, frantic writer troubled by debt, heartbreak, and the looming shadows of war traveled to Cornwall to seek Eleanor's counsel, expecting to find a guru laden with complex esoteric texts and secret rituals. Instead, the young writer found an elderly woman pouring tea with hands as steady as the stones of the cottage, her eyes shining with an unshakable, luminous peace. "Tell me the secret," the young visitor pleaded, leaning forward across the wooden table. "How did you survive a world that tried to crush you? How did you open doors that were bolted with iron?" Eleanor smiled softly, placed her teacup down upon the saucer, and looked out at the vast, golden light spreading across the ocean waves. "Child," Eleanor murmured, her voice carrying the cadence of a quiet river, "there were never any iron doors. There were never any enemies. There was only a soul that had forgotten the sound of its own word. I spent the first half of my life fighting shadows on a wall, throwing my fists against phantoms of my own making. But the moment I learned to stop fighting, to look my burdens in the eye, to baptize my failures as success, and to send goodwill where arrows were launched, the walls simply ceased to be. I did not conquer the world. I reclaimed my throne." As she spoke these words, a profound, electric silence filled the cottage, wrapping the young visitor in a warm, undeniable realization. The battles of the past dissolved into the salt air, leaving behind the absolute, radiant truth that the kingdom of heaven was not a distant place to be won through struggle, but a royal inheritance waiting to be claimed in the quiet sanctuary of the present moment. The journey from exhausted defender to sovereign master is complete, yet the application of these eternal laws is an ongoing, joyous dance of creation. To embody this truth today, you must step fully and unreservedly into your royal inheritance. Put down the weapons of human defense, release the need to struggle, manipulate, or beg for your good. You are invited to make your final, unshakable decree in this hour. Stand tall in your sacred sanctuary, knowing that you are divinely guided, divinely protected, and infinitely supplied. The iron doors have swung wide open. The way is clear. Your good is here. Go in peace, beloved. Use your tools, speak your word, and watch as the universe transforms before your very eyes. You are loved, you are supported, and you are already victorious. All is well, and all shall be well, forever and ever. And so it is.